Steve McQueen to no end.
Oh, yeah.
Because he didn't like losing.
Well, how did...
yeah, they did the Great Escape together, and I do know that it bugged James Gardner when they were doing that movie, that Steve was getting all the good stuff, because they didn't have any of that. When they brought Steve over to Germany to film that movie, John Sturges, the director, they didn't have a lot of those things that ended up in the movie. McQueen came up with that stuff. He came up with the whole thing about the motorcycle, because he just came over there and he said, "You don't have me doing anything of interest here. James Gardner's got all the good stuff." And they had that rivalry going. And so McQueen came up with the idea of the when he escapes, that he should get a German motorcycle and they should be chasing him, and he does the jump over the fence. That all came from him. And so James Gardner was ticked because it's like McQueen's getting all the attention.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, Steve McQueen was really into dirt bikes and all that stuff. I mean, he was crazy.
Oh, he won a lot of awards. He would go out and do races, motor races, cars and motorcycles, and he was a top contender in these things. That was his second career. All the time he was doing these movies, and the studios just couldn't stand it because they thought he was going to get smashed, and halfway in the middle of a movie, they would whenever he would do a movie, he was under contract that he couldn't go do any racing until production was done, because they just were sure he was going to get himself killed.
Oh, yeah.
Pull a James Dean on them,
Yeah, yeah.
So, but that was his real love, probably more than acting, was racing, and he won a lot of trophies.
Now, and Next Generation, how did Picard come about in that series, and how did they choose the actor?
That was Bob Justman's idea. Gene wanted to go with another Kirk type, another Jeffrey Hunter, William Shatner type for that role, the good leading man with the head full of hair and the whole thing. And Bob Justman came and suggested it, and he said, "Let's do something really different. Everybody's expecting that." And then they're going to compare this captain to the other captain. And how do you follow William Shatner? Because Bob Justman thought William Shatner was just terrific. I mean, they all did. Roddenberry, everybody, they were just felt so fortunate to get him for that show. They knew he was driving that show. And so Bob Justman came to Gene and suggested him. Bob had seen a play. And Patrick Stewart was in it. And so he came and he showed Gene the pictures of Patrick Stewart, and Gene said, "Oh, no, that's not the image. That's not the image I have." But he started showing it to the other people, and then they all started ganging up on Gene and saying, "No, this guy's great. You got to go check him out." So Gene went and checked him out, and either watched some film on him or went and saw him in a performance. I forget which it was. I've got the information on it. It'll be in the book when I get around to it, but I've gone through so much information I can't memorize all of it. After I write the book, I'm pretty good at remembering all the stuff because I've now written it and rewritten it and everything else. At this point, I've just been collecting all this material. And but Gene went and checked out Patrick Stewart, and he came back and he said, "He's terrific." And so suddenly he said, "No, let's go and go think way out of the box and do this." Because he didn't look like a leading man in a TV show.
He didn't.
Your standard.
And he didn't have hair.
And that's when the idea came up also to get Jonathan Frakes to be number one, which Gene always felt that the captain shouldn't be going down and risking his life. That a captain wouldn't do that. And Gene was of the real military, and he knows a captain would not do that. He would send his executive officer ashore. So when they decided to do Patrick Stewart, then Gene said, "Well, then let's get a William Shatner type and make him the guy that goes down to the planet, and he can do the action stuff." And that's when they created Riker and they brought in Jonathan Frakes.
Oh, great. Now, another R.W. Wells again is asking you a question. Whose idea was it to change the look of the Klingons from the TV series to the movie version to the Next Generation?
Well, that was done for the Star Trek the Motion Picture in '78 when they were making it. It came out in '79, and it was. I don't know who exactly came up with the idea, and but it was pretty much agreed upon from the makeup person, and Roddenberry liked the idea right away, and they all did, that they would make them more barbaric looking by having the spine kind of come right up on top of the head, and you see the vertebrae of the spine and the whole thing. And where it really came from is they had done Planet Earth. Gene Roddenberry and Bob Justman produced a pilot called Planet Earth, which was a remake of Genesis 2, done a couple years earlier, which Roddenberry had done. And the bad guys in there, the Kroll, they had that kind of vertebrae thing on the top of their heads, and they were bald so you could see it, you know. And so when they came around to do Next Generation, they really liked the way the Kroll had looked in Planet Earth, and they said, let's do that with the Klingons. And the question came up, well, but how do we explain, because the other show's rerunning everywhere, and how do we explain why those Klingons look one way and these look another way? And Gene, right off the top of his head, and he was this quick, he was really a very creative person, he said, because just like in the world, we have different looking people. We have white people, we have black people, we have tall people, short people, we have, you know, Hawaiians have a different build than Africans have, and Africans than Western Europeans, and Chinese, or, you know, the whole bit. So he said, you know, the Klingon Empire has lots of planets within it. And so the race kind of, you know, some of them, the genes get out there, but they're mixed with other genes. Now you've got a population on a planet that looks one way instead of another way. And that these particular Klingons are the more aggressive ones. So as time went on, they kind of gained more and more power. And they would be the ones you would see on the starships and so forth. They were the more warlike of the different races within the Klingon Empire. So that's how he explained it away.
Interesting.
By the way, we were talking about Secrets of Star Trek. Let me back up to the first show for a minute. And this is how good Gene was. And everyone's, oh, Mark, you must have loved Gene Roddenberry. I really liked Gene Roddenberry. I went and pitched Sarek to him for Next Generation. You know, I knew him for quite a few years. He was so supportive in these books. He had his faults. He had plenty of faults. But the guy was brilliant. He was a brilliant writer, and he gave us so much with his creations, you know. And this is just an example of how quick he is. When they were doing the first show, very early on in the first season, all this stuff is in These Are the Voyages, Season 1, the first book. And they were doing an episode called Dagger of the Mind. And there's a penal planet, and this one convict, or the inmate, escapes from the penal planet and gets aboard the Enterprise. And Simon Van Gelder, if anybody remembers that. And he can't tell them what's going on because something's wrong in his head. Every time he tries to explain what was happening on the penal planet, he gets choked up, he can't get the words out, and so forth. So Kirk goes down to investigate. And while he's down there, Spock and McCoy decide to hypnotize Van Gelder so he can relax and they can probe his mind. Well, in the script, McCoy's trying to hypnotize him the old-fashioned way. And NBC sent in a memo, and it's in the book, you can read it. They send a memo and they say, you cannot hypnotize people on the NBC television network because you may hypnotize some of our viewers.
Oh, wow.
This is what they worried about.
Now.
And so Roddenberry writes back and he says, but this is crucial to the story. We have to unlock Van Gelder's mind. They've used the neural neutralizer on him down there, and you can't just snap him out of it. And they said, nope, you can't hypnotize him. So Gene sat down and he came up with the Vulcan mind meld, where Spock can place his hands on Van Gelder's head and telepathically merge his mind with Van Gelder's and get in there. And now Spock can say all the stuff that we need to know that happened to Van Gelder down on this penal planet. So Gene came up with this brilliant thing, which is now so much part of Star Trek, because of the sensors, because it was the only way to get around them. It was the same thing with the transporter. In the original proposal for Star Trek, the Enterprise was going to land on planets and take off. It wasn't going to look like it ended up looking. That was an amazing design, but it was going to be more of a standard rocket, starship type of a thing. And they realized that it would just be too expensive. Every week to be doing the effects of this ship landing and taking off from different planets. So that's when they came up with the idea of the transporter.
Oh, wow. Now, we're almost out of time. Now, I need to ask you this. Yeah. I'm sorry I cut you short. We only got a couple minutes. Why don't you tell the listeners of the screenplay or the stories you pitched and that ended up, being an episode?
Well, the first one was Sarek. I met with Gene and I asked him how old Vulcans lived to be, and he said, well, we haven't figured out. We think like 350, 400 years old. And I said, and the new show is going to be 200 years after the first one. So I said, Sarek, Spock's father, could still be alive. And the actor is still working, and he's got gray hair now. You don't even have to fake it. And Gene really liked Mark Leonard, who played that character anyway. And I said, he says, well, where are you going with this? And I said, well, I'm just wondering what happens to a Vulcan when he goes through senility. And that caught Gene's ear, and he turned to me and said, I don't know, what do you think happens to them? And I said, well, they're so proud, and they don't want to show emotion, and they would never want to be seen in bad situations. What if Sarek is called back into service because there was a treaty he negotiated years earlier, and it's falling apart, and they only trust him, these people? It's got to be him, or they're not going to talk to anybody else. So he has to be transported aboard the Enterprise to go out and do this. But he's going through senility, and because they're telepathic, whatever the anxiety he's feeling is going to manifest itself in whoever's near him, in Riker perhaps, and then Riker's going to go challenge Picard and get into an argument with Picard and all that. And so Gene loved the idea. He said, go write it. And I went and wrote it. And I brought it back in, and he said, I've changed my mind. I don't want to bring anybody from the original show into the new show until the new show's gotten its footing and everything. So let's make it a different Vulcan. And that just killed me. I had to go change it to somebody else. And then they didn't make it until the third year, and then Mike Piller came in, and he said, let's switch it back to Sarek. That's what makes this story work. By then, Gene was in ill health, and he wasn't coming in much, and so he kind of turned it over to Mike Piller and Rick Berman. And so they went ahead and brought Mark Leonard in and did the first connecting episode from the first show to the second show. Anyway, that's my story. So that was the first thing. And then they kept inviting me in every year for pitch sessions, and I was working for another series. So I really couldn't do scripts for them. And Gene felt that the one script that I did felt too much like the original show, the pacing and everything, because I loved the original show. But they liked my idea, so they said, well, come in and pitch and give us some springboards and everything. So I brought in one called Cupid, Q-BD, and so it was Cupid falls in love with a human, a mortal woman, and he despises humans. And they changed the story quite a bit, but they kept the title and they kept the springboard of that one. And I brought in another one, turned into an episode called Rascal, where I thought, what if Picard starts growing younger? And I was kind of ripping off an original episode where Kirk grew older and everything. So I gave him a couple springboards that turned into episodes.
Great.
So my name's only on one episode, but I was in there for on a couple others. So that was my connection there. And then I wrote a script for Star Trek Continues a couple years ago called Divided We Stand. And the title makes sense if you see the episode. And you can watch that at StarTrekContinues.com.
Now, your books. We got like 2 minutes here. Tell the people where they can find your books and the names of the books.
Well, it's These Are the Voyages, Star Trek, the original series. On the book cover, it says These Are the Voyages, TOS, the original series, because TOS means the original series, just for spacing purposes, but it's the original series. And there's volume 1, 2, and 3, actually season 1, 2, and 3. One book for each season. And it's all the memos, not all of them, not every page of them, because these guys wrote 20-page memos, but I took pieces out of all these memos and wove them together so that you feel like, with a chapter for each episode, you feel like you're witnessing each episode being born, the writing of it, the production of it, the ratings, all that information's in there, even fan letters that came in, all that stuff's in these books. They won a Saturn Award as literary achievement. Leonard Nimoy called them astounding. So any Star Trek fan needs to read these books.
Where can they find them, Mark?
I'm a Star Trek fan, and I have them. And the first one is now being released as an audiobook with a cast of 100, including some of the original participants. Dorothy Fontana's reading her own memos, things like that.